after all of these weeks of protesting, of fighting, of pushing for political change, to now have it culminate in this, of like Parliament voting for a super undemocratic move forward, is really frustrating.
There were elements of a coup, and in fact, this was a coup.
I have another quite controversial opinion about that, is that we still are experiencing the first revolution.
Naked Pravda.
Welcome to the Naked Pravda. I'm your host, your usual host, Kevin Rotrok, the managing editor of Meduza's English language edition. But today's show is going to be a wonderful deviation from the norm, the boring, awful norm. I'm just popping in today to say hello, to remind you of my very important existence, and to introduce you to Айлиш Харт, my news editor at Meduza, who will lead us today through a discussion with three exceptional guests about the latest round of political mayhem in Kyrgyzstan. If you're not up to speed on your Central Asian geography, that's the nation sandwiched between Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and some country called China. There's a lot to cover on this episode, so I'll let Айлиш take it away.
On October 4th, voters in Kyrgyzstan cast their ballots in the parliamentary elections. Since then, the country has seen major protests, the election results annulled, and the president, Sooronbay Jээнбекov, stepped down after bowing to pressure from the country's newly appointed prime minister, a politician by the name of Sadыр Жапаров, who was sitting in prison until just a few weeks ago. In the last 10 days, Жапаров has gone on to become acting president while remaining prime minister, and election officials scheduled a repeat parliamentary vote only to see it postponed indefinitely. Meanwhile, lawmakers have been pushing through legislation like it's going out of style, and Kyrgyzstan is planning to hold a presidential election in January. For those of you who don't usually keep up with Kyrgyzstan, you, like me, are probably wondering how all of this happened in such a short period of time. So to get a fuller picture of what's going on, I invited three guests on the show to talk about the lead up to the vote, the ensuing political crisis, and what might happen next.
We understood that something definitely is going wrong with the elections. And we started understanding it, long before the elections actually started.
That's Bektur Искендер, the co-founder of Klop, an independent media organization based in Kyrgyzstan that's known for both its news coverage and investigative journalism. I asked Bektur what it was like covering the lead up to the elections and whether the opposition protests were as spontaneous as they seemed to those of us watching from abroad.
The thing that we did not expect to happen is, that the consequences of these elections would be so dramatic. Like, I would not imagine, president resigning or, complete change of political powers going on and so on. I mean, this was something that I would not imagine happening this year, but all these wrongdoings that were going on during the elections, they actually did not surprise us that much, because we have been witnessing, how authorities were preparing to organize something like this. And again, having experience of living in Kyrgyzstan for, my entire life, seeing all the other elections, I could actually see the signs. The only thing that we could not expect is that the protest after the elections would be so large. And now I understand, of course, that after, the results were published, even according to official results, we still had around 30 or 35% of voters not being represented by any party at the parliament. So you could imagine now that there would be a certain backlash. We just could not imagine that it would turn so dramatic, For me, the biggest surprise was not even when the police started attacking protesters. Of course, for me, the biggest surprise was that people kept on fighting the police. I thought, when the police started attacking protesters on the 5th of October in the evening, I thought, okay, that's the end, like all the protest is over. Now we have like this, 4 parties that made it into the parliament, and they will basically control everything in the country. And whoever was against the results of the elections, will have to get prepared to something else. I was already thinking, how should we, for example, prepare to cover the local elections, which are planned for the next year? But then suddenly, things started changing.
Bektur wasn't the only one caught off guard by how quickly things started developing after the protests on October 5th. The next day, election officials invalidated the voting results, and the prime minister announced his resignation. Members of parliament replaced him with Sadыр Japarov, a politician who protesters had freed from prison just hours earlier. But was Japarov taking power really what the protesters wanted? I asked Dr. Erika Marат, an associate professor at the National Defense University's College of International Affairs in Washington, D.C., whose research focuses on violence, mobilization, and security institutions in Eurasia.
What's important is that Jээнbekov really acted silly and escalated peaceful protests on the first day when protesters convened. So the day after parliamentary elections, reformist, quote-unquote, reformist political parties and their supporters, they convened in central Bishkek and were demanding new elections. But they were peaceful, they were hopeful, they were orderly, and even, there was really this sense of optimism that so many people came together to ask for a repeat of parliamentary elections. And then what Jëэнbekov did is he deployed police violence against protesters and basically escalated tensions and allowed some, especially radical members of the mob, or we don't even know who those people were really. Were they part of the opposition rally or some other, crowds, but they attacked government headquarters or parliamentary building and Jëэнbekov's headquarters in that building. And that's basically when things went out of control and Kyrgyzstan really entered political crisis.
At this point, President Jëэнbekov called the events a coup. On October 9th, he declared a state of emergency in the capital and disputed Japarov's status as prime minister. Nevertheless, the parliament confirmed Japarov on October 14th, and the first thing he did as prime minister was deliver a speech to a crowd of demonstrators outside of Bishkek's House of Government. He called for Jëэнbekov's resignation, and it didn't take long for this wish to come true. The next day, Jëэнbekov stepped down, claiming that he wanted to avoid bloodshed. Before, Jëэнbekov made his 180 switch and decided he was going to step down, he talked about what was happening as an attempted coup. And obviously the minute kind of protests break out, people start drawing comparisons about events in Belarus or past uprisings in Kyrgyzstan. So I wanted to ask what's your kind of take on these comparisons, or rather where you would situate what's happening?
Yeah, there were elements of a coup. And in fact, this was a coup. This was Japarov's party taking over and outmaneuvering everyone, the parliament and Jëэнbekov, and maybe, brokering deals. We don't know. Again, this is pure speculation, but brokering deals with Jëэнbekov's former allies, powerful allies behind closed doors. So they outmaneuvered everyone. So it was a coup, but it also highlighted how weak Jëэнbekov was and how insecure he was in his own position. And I think that's, if we want to really dig deeper, why he found himself in this situation is that he himself also came to power thanks to support of his predecessor, Azimбек Atambayev, who promoted Jëэнbekov to presidency, supported him during presidential elections, hoping that Jëэнbekov would be his loyal follower. But Jëэнbekov turned against Atambayev. He came to power thanks to those administrative resources, but then he turned against Atambayev and basically alienated himself from many other political camps in Kyrgyzstan.
I'd actually like to follow up a little bit more on Japarov as kind of a character in Kyrgyzstan's politics. He was serving this 11-year prison sentence when he was suddenly released from jail and kind of catapulted his way to the top. So does he enjoy some degree of popular support?
He is a charismatic leader. He is a nationalist, populist who was able to gain support among some groups in Kyrgyzstan, especially in rural Kyrgyzstan, on calls to nationalize the largest gold mine, Kumtor, that is currently mostly owned by a Canadian firm, and then, to clean up corruption and so on. So his charisma, populism, nationalism nationalism does win him genuine support among the population. But of course, he also benefited from his political allies who've been in politics for decades now, and who were able to use this moment of chaos and proclaim Japarov as their leader, as the leader of the country, basically.
People who were not expecting Japarov to suddenly become such a central figure in the post-revolutionary period, if we can still call it revolution, of course, that's another big question. I think people who didn't expect it were mostly from Bishkek. That's another important thing about Kyrgyzstan, is that most part of Bishkek completely misunderstands what's going on outside of Bishkek. We live, in this privileged bubble, mainly Russian-speaking bubble, people who earn much more than, the rest of the country, who are able to travel, who are able to study, we definitely live a completely different life. We don't understand the struggles of people who live outside of Bishkek. Now, one of the ways, that people were trying to solve their problems outside of Bishkek was by going to Russia and to work there as labor migrants. Again, something that people from Bishkek don't do that often, as people from provinces of Kyrgyzstan do. And this is an important point. Sadыр Жапаров was especially, and still is, popular among our labor migrants. Now, our labor migrants are a very important part of the population. First of all, we're talking about a lot of people. Currently, I think there are around 1 million or something of Kyrgyz labor migrants. We should recheck this figure, but I think it's kind of close to this range, So it's quite a huge proportion of the population that works in Russia, and they of course have their families. So what Japarov did, there was a period in Japarov's biography when he was traveling all around Kazakhstan and Russia and meeting all these migrant communities. This is a very interesting part of his biography, which I think, if Japarov becomes an important political person in the future, we should research that period in his biography, because I think that during that period, he's done something important that we in Kyrgyzstan did not notice at all.
When was that? Do you know off the top of your head?
That was from 2014 till 2017. So he dedicated 3 years. He spent 3 years outside of Kyrgyzstan. Now, so it should be understood why it happened. 2013, one of his protests against Kumtor, which was held in Karakol, the city in the east of Kyrgyzstan, went a little bit out of control when they took the governor of this region as a hostage, which was a bit funny, to be honest. They just basically locked him in a car, and surrounded the car and didn't want to let him out until, he kind of does something with this nationalization thing. It was not really as violent as it sounds, It lasted not for a long time. But it was used then by authorities as a reason to imprison Japarov. So he was officially convicted as a kidnapper because of this episode, even though the governor who was kidnapped later on said that he doesn't have anything against Japarov and he's totally fine with what happened, So it was a little bit of a strange story. Japarov, understanding that he might be, arrested at any moment, he left Kyrgyzstan. And that's exactly when he started his kind of tour around Kazakhstan and Russia, meeting all the migrants and everything. Now, you should understand, how migrants were feeling. So for them, it was like suddenly their voices were heard. They suddenly saw a politician, a former parliament member, a former, government official who was so open to them, who was meeting them face to face, who was listening to their, problems, and who was actually telling all the right things and doing it. And then he came back to Kyrgyzstan in 2017, knowing that he would be arrested, which happened. And so he was spending his time in jail, until 5th of October, when he was released. And by the time of his release, he had already had, this enormous popularity, especially among labor migrants and their relatives. Of course, people in Bishkek were taken by surprise, because I think for many of people in Bishkek, they just hadn't known about this phenomenon at all. They were just not following this. And there were many people in Bishkek asking questions like, why Japarov? Where did he, come from?
When I was doing research for this podcast episode, I read an article published by Open Democracy that argued that the degree of popular support for Japarov was very apparent on Kyrgyz language social media. I wanted to talk about this argument during the episode, and as it turned out, my third guest brought it up before I could even ask the question.
Trying to gauge support for Japarov is difficult, just because as of 2 weeks ago, no one would have thought that he was relevant. Like, he was serving a really long jail term. But a really interesting article in Open Democracy by Gulza Bayelova and Joldon Kutmaniliyev looked into Facebook groups that were in support of Sадыр Жапаров. And I think that this is a really interesting investigation into the way that different platforms have different politics in Kyrgyzstan.
That's Collin Wud, a doctoral candidate in political science at Columbia University, who researches civil society and identity in Central Asia. She's also a regular contributor for the international affairs magazine, The Diplomat.
I had become accustomed to Instagram as the social media platform where political discussions happen in Kyrgyzstan, both progressive and more conservative, that people have gotten really creative in how they use the different features on Instagram to reach really large audiences. And young people tell me oh, Facebook is for older people. It's really not something that I use. Only my parents use it. But this research from Bayelova and Kutmaniliyev shows that there are these massive, massive groups in support of Japarov. So one went from having, I think it was 18,000, 30,000 members one night, and the next day had almost 130,000 followers. And so trying to gauge okay, is that spike in interest tied to the fact that this person just appeared overnight and is now entered as a central figure in this revolution coup power change? Or is it more traditional, bots were bought or followers were bought in ways that I think are pretty common globally, but especially in the region? But when it comes to trying to understand the content or the angle at which people were supporting him, it seems that he represents a way, an alternative path than people in power. So one of the big calls of youth groups in the early days of the protest was for lustration. So this is a Latin term that is to ceremonially purify, and it was really big in Eastern European countries, immediately after the collapse of communism, but then several times throughout following major power changes. And the idea being that if you served under the previous regime, you really should not and cannot be working for our new government. New voices only. If you were in it in the past, you are compromised and we don't need you leading us. So there was this call for lustration. So you think okay, Japarov, who used to be a member of parliament before, was arrested for an attempted coup in 2013, for hostage taking in 2013. How does this constitute or fulfill this goal of lustration? Why are these people who were demanding lustration not more upset about this? But I think that because he has been out of the political game for 7 years, people do see him as this kind of anti-establishment, not necessarily tied down in the muck of the Matraimovs, not tied out in the muck of the 6th parliamentary session. So in a kind of strange way, he checks the bill of lustration, especially I think for citizens who are outside of the capital.
One of the things that they got into in that article was they kind of spoke about the divide that we're seeing, rather than looking at it in terms of kind of the north-south divide you hear people talk about when they talk about Kyrgyzstan. They saw it more of a Russophone versus Kyrgyz language divide, and especially in terms of if you're looking at what social media people are paying attention to. So I just wanted to ask what you thought about taking that perspective on it.
Yeah, I think that it actually is a really great way of thinking about social cleavages in the country, because to a certain extent, I think the north-south divide is not as neat as Russophone, Turcophone, Kyrgyzophone, but I think that the rural-urban dynamics and the centers of economy do kind of map onto the north-south divide, insofar as a lot of the people in rural areas of Jalalabad, Osh, and Batken oblasts do not speak Russian, or if they do, it's really rudimentary. That's not entirely fair to say.
Maybe they don't use it, might be a better way of putting it.
They don't use it. Although, I mean, a lot of children now in cities in the southern oblasts are going to Russian schools, I think, which reflects economic trends of that a lot of people from these regions are migrating to Russia for work and to want their children to be educated in that. But I think, yeah, that the Russian-Kyrgyz language debate maps onto a rural-urban discussion in which, like, is it really fair that Bishkek, with a population of a little bit over 1 million people, in a country that itself is only 6 million people, like, how much sway should these kind of Bishkekchane, should these, like, capital dwellers get to have over national politics? So, and I think that the question of trying to understand the kind of qualitative differences in content is really, really important. And it's something that, like, I advocate as, like, a social scientist who works on the region, that this is, like, demonstrates the importance of outside experts building skills in both languages. Because I think that if you only speak Russian, you miss out on tons of information and, like, the broader, I think, anything outside of the capital, what people are talking about, what the temperature check is. If you only speak Russian, you're going to miss out on that. But on the flip side, if you only speak Kyrgyz, you also miss out on this really, I think, like, central, maybe we can call it, like, the agenda setting process. Is that I think that a lot of the youth groups and Russian speaking folks in Bishkek do have a lot of power in kind of setting up the terms of the discussion up front. And then the Kyrgyz speaking activists or those who are outside of the capital, like, end up having to respond to it. So yeah, I think that in addition to the kind of traditional media versus social media, and then even within social media, looking across platforms and different demographic details of who flocks to what platforms, but within both of those forms, looking at Russian versus Kyrgyz language could help us moving forward to try to explain the public opinion with regards to, I guess, I don't fully know how to call the 2020 events. Is it count fully as a revolution?
They don't have a name yet.
Yeah, regime change. Like, yeah, the political changes of October 2020. How people think about them.
With Japarov in power, the street protests have subsided, and the political battle appears to have moved to the parliament. Election officials tried to schedule a repeat parliamentary vote for December 20th. But it was postponed indefinitely. Meanwhile, lawmakers have been pushing through legislation to change election procedures, and on top of the fact that Kyrgyzstan needs to hold 2 elections in the near future, there's talk of a referendum.
There was an emergency session of parliament in which there were competing bills pushed through. So one was to lower the threshold from 7% to 3%. So that would be great from a kind of representation perspective of giving these smaller, more niche, more reform-oriented parties a shot at actually getting through and securing seats. This bill also was going to lower the deposit that parties had to pay in order to compete in elections from 5 million soms to 1 million som, making it just lowering the cost of entry, lowering the barrier of entry to smaller parties. So, for example, the Reforma Party famously crowdsourced its 5 million som deposit, which was pretty impressive. Normally this comes from big business, aka organized crime. Yeah, so those two things, which are seen as like progressive wins, these were the demands of the activist groups. Like, wow, great, okay, we're going to do these new elections in a way that people actually want, and that will maybe create a new parliament that will do what we want them to do. But then at that same extraordinary meeting, Parliament also pushed through a bill that walked back the new elections and opened up the possibility for a constitutional reform. So now there are not going to be elections on December 20th for a new parliament. The logic of this given is twofold. One, that they're saying that it's just like extraordinarily draining to do elections at all. And in a context where Kyrgyzstan has been struggling with the pandemic and has been struggling with economic fallout resulting from drop in reparations, it's really a stretch for this country to be able to put on 2 elections in the span of 3 months. So the first logic before was like, we should just wait to have elections until we're a little bit more economically and epidemiologically stable, which interpret that however you will. But then the other logic that was given, I think more worryingly by Japarov in an interview with Al Jazeera, was that Kyrgyzstan moved to a parliamentary system too quickly, and that the country is not like culturally or like civically developed enough to handle this form of government, and that he thinks that a referendum to change Kyrgyzstan's electoral system to a presidential system would be beneficial for its political growth. And he's looking into changing the constitutional rules about whether the sitting prime minister is allowed to run for president. So there's kind of these two things that happened at once, which just means the uncertainty over what's happening with Kyrgyzstan's political vacuum will continue. I think that the whiplash over new developments of, okay, now Parliament gathered again and did what? Okay, this guy announced himself head of this, and then what? That's going to continue until, I guess at minimum, the referendum is passed or decided on. So we're still deep in murky waters, but it does seem like some political order has emerged. It's just hard to get a sense of how that political order is received, both in Bishkek and in the more rural areas of the country. That remains to be seen.
I'm kind of hearing two things here. It sounds like he's saying, we don't have time to pull together an election, but we do have time to pull together a referendum, a democratic referendum on making the country less democratic.
Yeah. And given how the last referendum was just kind of shoved through without much public discussion, it is worrying to hear this emphasis on constitutional referendum by public vote, as opposed to this being something discussed in parliament, discussed openly with input from citizens, and something that goes through the proper procedures. Local legal scholar Sanya Tuktugazieva just did a talk with Azatuk about the rushed process of rolling back the new elections. And she's really, really upset with how unconstitutional this thing was. Given the emphasis on legal framework, on правовое поле, it's really a huge step backwards for Parliament to, after all of these weeks of protesting, of fighting, of pushing for political change, to now have it culminate in this of Parliament voting for a super undemocratic move forward is really frustrating. But I think people, as news of this gets out, I would expect some of the younger and more mobilized activist networks to be really vocal against it.
I'm disappointed with our parliament as usual. I mean, of course, I would expect it. I'm just amazed at, how people can be so coward. It's just crazy, how 120 people, of course, not all of them, but the majority of them, I mean, it's already the third time they are completely changing their, political direction just because the president changes. This parliament started working when Atambayev was still a president, and they were most of them were devoted, fans of Atambayev back then. But then as soon as Atambayev became a bad guy, they switched, their mind immediately and started, praising Jээнбекov. And now, of course, they hate Jëэнбekov and they, try to be as close to Japarov as possible. And unfortunately, what is going on is that Japarov and whoever is behind him, I still don't understand, are trying to seize the power and gain as much control as possible. And in order to do that, they are trying to change the constitution. They are trying to change the format of parliament elections. They are trying to make president a more powerful person. I mean, another problem with Japarov is that he changes his mind so often. We already published a couple of stories about how Japarov changed his mind, on certain issues during last 2 weeks, which is crazy. I mean, it's just why does he do that? I don't understand. And this parliament is basically so, as I said, so covered. I mean, they are afraid of everything. They are especially afraid of, criminal groups or whatever. I mean, but they don't have enough, they are parliament members. They have this power. They can change so much to the better, but they're absolutely not interested in that. I'm very disappointed. And that's why, it's really hard to expect what's going to happen in Kyrgyzstan, for example, even in the next 2 weeks or so. Now the plan is they are trying to initiate the referendum on changing the constitution. This will be, to be honest, quite a disaster, because I think it's weird to change the rules during such a turbulent period when it was not something that people demanded for. When people went to protest, their demand was clear and simple. they wanted re-election. According to the constitution that we have now, just it should be fair and free and so on. That's it. It was so simple.
Listening to Colleen and Bektur talk about the most recent developments in parliament, it was clear that Kyrgyzstan's politicians were straying beyond the demands of the protesters and civil society. But Dr. Marat maintained some optimism that Kyrgyzstan might find a legal way out of the crisis.
So Kyrgyzstan is one of those countries, and perhaps we see similarities now in Belarus, but also during Euromaidan in Ukraine, is when the state is so backwards and is so corrupt and detached from the society, while the society is really full of activism and demand and civil society networks that want better governance, want better representation, less corruption. And the state and the incumbents, so specifically the president that had to resign, Jëэнbekov, he was blind to that or incapable of understanding the real social and political processes that were happening in the non-state realm. And unfortunately, the current acting president, he also seems to be detached from the demands of the activists, political and civic activists. I think he is repeating the mistakes of Jëэнbekov. He is risking of seeing protests against his regime again in the before or after next, the rerun of parliamentary elections. Japarov is trying to change constitution now to make presidency more powerful. And the next parliamentary elections, there is an opportunity to stabilize Kyrgyzstan again and allow all major political parties enter the parliament again, win seats in the parliament again, because this has been the case in the past 10 years since the previous regime change in April 2010, that a system that was set in place after April 2010 allowed all political parties win a little bit, but not everything. So, have everyone lose something and win something. So kind of created an equilibrium within the parliament, and all major political showdowns took place within the walls of the parliament building and not, outside on the streets against those in power. And hopefully this equilibrium will be again regained in repeat elections. But of course, now a lot will depend on how Japarov will be able to actually set up the conditions for that and allow a more fair and transparent competition among political parties. So not repeat what Jëэнbekov did in September, October.
I also asked Colleen to make some predictions about what might happen next. How do you see things going forward?
I'll preface this with that it's super hard to make any predictions, let alone in a situation that's already proven itself to be super unstable and really fickle, and if I feel like I've gotten whiplash following the pendulum back and forth. But I will say that the parliamentary decision to, on the one hand, cancel the new elections and put forward this proposal for a referendum that would switch the country to more of a presidential system, but at the same time proposing to lower the threshold and lower the barriers of entry, that I think the fact that both of these are on the table means that the battle isn't over yet, that I think that there will have to be more discussion about which path is the best way forward. And to that extent, one of the only predictions that I feel sort of comfortable about making is the potential role for youth activists in keeping this issue front and center. So this is the young people who back in November and December were leading the Reakcija protests, 1, 2, and 3, that all happened right in a row until COVID led to shutdown. But I think what's been interesting to watch with these civic movements, with these young people who are very explicit about the fact that they are apolitical, that they don't have political ambitions, that they have become very practiced in articulating specific political demands and have gotten better about channeling their goals through the formal political channels. So I think whereas a few years ago, youth activists could get 1,000 people out on the street, they could get people to march against something, against the powers that be, against Atambayev, against Jëэнbekov. But what's been really special and inspiring in the last few months is how specific these youth activists have gotten. And I think there has been this little proliferation of civic movements in Bishkek in the last few months, but they're also, I've seen them popping up in Osh, in Karakol, that they're also happening out in the regions, that there's a consciousness of needing to involve the other oblasts in this discussion, and to like recognizing that it's not enough just to say, we don't like corruption, we don't like your politics, but making really specific demands. So like the moving to the 3% was a specific demand that came from one group called Bashtan Bashta. And I think that that is promising moving forward, that if there is this attempt to shove through a constitutional referendum, that we can expect to see these young organizers out and protesting against it and organizing to get people to vote against it.
Bektur also felt that the political crisis was still in its early days, and even thought it was too soon to put a label on it. Is there a name for everything that's happening in Kyrgyzstan yet?
I think it's too early to say that it's a revolution. We once called our 2005 revolution a revolution. And, and then we were like, the president who came after that was so much worse that, was it truly a revolution? I have another quite controversial opinion about that, is that we still are experiencing the first revolution. It just started in 2005. It just has not finished yet. We just have, kind of new iterations. We're like a startup. Kyrgyzstan is like a startup. We kind of had, this alpha version of Kyrgyzstan, and then we upgrade it, and then something doesn't work. Then we do the new upgrade, new update. So we now have like Kyrgyzstan 1.4 or something, Like this update is one of the craziest ones, I should say. So we'll see. Like we'll be able, I think, to give adequate, more or less, adequate comments about, what's going on, and adequate evaluation of what's going on only after the parliament elections. Because if corruption continues, if they keep on promoting, pro-government parliament members or people who would be just, willing to do whatever the president, whoever that would be, asks them to do, then we changed nothing. That would be the worst scenario. And then we'll have to fight for the same things again from the scratch. The cycle will repeat, and it will inevitably lead to a new political crisis. I hope they understand it, and I hope, that there would be positive changes. What I think is important right now for us, civil society in Kyrgyzstan, to do is to invest into education as much as possible. I was, very much thrilled by what was going on in Belarus since August. I was in Belarus like in 2019 and saw, how civil society became so much stronger actually during the period of this all possible sorts of repressions against, civil society. And I think Belarus was a great example of, how many small communities can then join their efforts and become a really strong power. I think we in Kyrgyzstan have so much more opportunities to do this because we don't have those restrictions that Belarus had all these years. And I would love us, everybody in Kyrgyzstan who is worried about the situation, to invest in all possible sorts of education, especially outside of Bishkek. If we start investing our resources into educating at least a small group of people, or if we also learn something from them, if we build more bridges between Bishkek and the rest of the country, if we put all our efforts to create this many small educated communities all around the country of people who would be very conscious when it comes to the civil rights and to the country's development, and to whatever will make life in Kyrgyzstan safer, freer, and richer. I mean, that would be amazing, and that would be our best response to everything that is happening right now in Kyrgyzstan, which we might be very upset with.
Since Meduza primarily covers Russia, I thought it was only fitting to finish each interview by asking my guest for a personal take on Moscow's role in the events going on in Kyrgyzstan. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more on what Moscow's role is, or why the Kremlin might be sitting back a bit and seeing what happens?
Interestingly, Russia may have played a role as well in completing Japarov's ascent to power. So Moscow has been sitting back throughout the crisis in Kyrgyzstan, and this is not the first time that Moscow never really took an active role in making statements on what it prefers to see happen in Kyrgyzstan. But one fact that we can analyze here is that Putin sent his deputy chief of administration, Kozak, who met with Japarov and Jээнbekov at the same time when Jëэнbekov was still the president, elected president. I mean, he was the president, the legitimate president. And we don't know the details of that meeting. And Jëэнbekov, as president, never really disclosed what were the details. But after the meeting and the days following the meeting, Japarov became really loud in his calls for Jëэнbekov to resign. And Jëэнbekov did step down from his position. So it really, the connection here is uncanny for many in Kyrgyzstan, because I think the perception here is that behind the closed doors, Kozak really showed support. And this is pure speculation, of course. We don't have any transcripts from that meeting, but Japarov was emboldened in his calls for resignation, and Jëэнbekov seemed a lot weaker, in the days following the meeting. And the speculations there is that Kozak showed support towards Japarov and dismissed Jëэнbekov's attempts to stay in power.
Russia is totally okay with unfair elections. We can understand. I mean, all these observers from, Commonwealth of Independent States, usually the most useless observers you can imagine at the elections, and mostly from Russia, they, of course, said that, oh, yeah, absolutely, these elections were held, freely and fairly and everything was fine, So Russia was totally okay with how things were going until, things just started getting out of everybody's control. I think Russia is still in this process of trying to understand who should they work with. I would not be surprised if they still haven't found. Thing is, Kyrgyzstan itself has a lot of actors, a lot of, political players, let's say. It's really hard to understand who supports whom. People in Kyrgyzstan switch their positions, with a record-breaking speed. The same politician in Kyrgyzstan can have a history of being both in opposition, in civil society, in government, in the presidential administration, whatever, and all within 10 years or something. You cannot really rely on anybody in Kyrgyz politics. And that's why I think Russia is a bit, in this chaotic period when they themselves don't understand who should they work with now, who can they rely on? But then they also have the competition, because I'm pretty sure that probably the US is also looking for their allies right now in the Kyrgyz politics, trying to understand who should they work with. China is kind of looking for their own allies because with, Japarov's rhetorics of nationalizing everything, China might lose control of quite a lot of things. They need to have a stable government in Kyrgyzstan that will allow them, to keep on exploring our gold mines or whatever.
So Russia has its interests in Kyrgyzstan, that much is clear. But when I asked her about Moscow's role in the crisis, Collin Wuд was adamant about the fact that we shouldn't overstate the extent of the Kremlin's involvement. It seems like your take is that this is not a geopolitical crisis. So I'd like to hear about why you're not convinced that the Kremlin has a role here, or...
It's just because it doesn't make a ton of sense for Russia to be interested in causing instability, when I think that my reading of it is that Putin and Russia broadly just want there to be stability in their backyard and want there to be stability with the partners that they work most closely with. So Kyrgyzstan is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. It doesn't benefit Russia economically to have this type of uncertainty and this type of economic implosion in its backyard. So from the perspective of did Russia have a role in undermining Kyrgyzstan's elections? I think is a resounding no. And I think whoever was in the position of running the ship doesn't really matter per se. I mean, I think saying that Kyrgyzstan is one of the closest allies of, or a closest partner of Russia is off the mark, given that when President Jëэнbekov went to visit Moscow just before the election, Putin called him by the wrong name. He called him Shariman Sharipovich. So I think a bit of kind of chauvinism is definitely present there. But I think what was interesting was the way that Kyrgyzstani social media has reacted to two things. One was Putin in a presser kind of talking seemingly a little bit off the cuff about Kyrgyzstan, but used a pretty condescending tone to describe its development as a post-Soviet country and said that the country is still learning how to have a government, how to run itself. And I think people were really upset by the tenor of these comments. And I saw a lot of sarcastic responses in both Russian and in Kyrgyz about sovereignty, about how Japarov responds to this is going to kind of how he sees his role, like his relationship vis-a-vis Russia. And the other that people are really reacting to was a meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Russia and from Kyrgyzstan, and they are going back and forth, and the Kyrgyz official says something in Kyrgyz, and Lavrov responds like, you need to respect your host, respect the Khazaev. And so people on Instagram and on Twitter are freaking out of like, was he talking to our official? Was he talking to the translator? What does it mean if he like cut off our leader who's speaking Kyrgyz and told him to respect their host? Like, I think that there's this geopolitical awareness is there. And I think there's a little bit of tension over Russia's involvement. But I think as like a proximate cause of the unrest, it's really unfair to like look directly to Russia for that.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think like it seems like we're seeing a bit of an interesting reversal here, because I mean, most of the time the question is like, what is the Kremlin going to do about Kyrgyzstan? And now it sounds like people in Kyrgyzstan are saying like, what is Bishkek going to do about the Kremlin?
Yeah, for sure. I think that that's a really apt way of putting it, of like, people have come to expect that like, okay, their leader needs to do something to like either like lay down at the feet of Russian authorities or like have this kind of staunch, like trying to push themselves away and be more independent. So I think, yeah, that makes total sense that people are waiting to see, okay, like what is Japarov going to do with regards to Putin and to Moscow?
The Naked Pravda is a podcast from Meduza, our only English language show, and I hope you'll recommend us to your friends and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're tuning in to help put this program in front of more people. Thanks for listening, and come back soon.